guitar, cult, rock and roll, worshipped by a few but ignored on the whole. Meet the Feebles is a film cult classic that I meet seem totally unfazed until sometimes there's
DIY artist. Was there like ever a desire to be on a record label, or was it always just about doing it yourself?
I was always, from the beginning of making up songs when I was in my early 20s, it was Daniel Johnston who was my biggest inspiration. And the way that Daniel Johnston had just recorded cassettes of his songs and handed them out to people, and it just seemed like the organic process of the songs themselves hopefully being true enough and strong enough that people who got the tapes would make copies of the tapes for other people and be like, oh, you have to hear this. And that just seemed like such a, I don't know, it was so mind-blowing to me. I'd never heard of something like that before I got into his stuff. So that was really just my whole guiding principle of even making songs in the first place. I'd never been somebody who was really involved in that before that. I was always into making comic books since I was young, and never would have thought of myself as somebody who was going to grow up and make music and be a touring performer or anything. And making these tapes of my songs, I never had any notion of being on a record label or having any, it never would have crossed my mind that that was gonna, I would never have sent my stuff to a record label. I would never have thought that people would want to put out something like that. I just thought the realest way to do something would be to just put these songs on tapes, and if the songs were good enough, just as songs, then they would have a life of their own and just go on from person to person, just completely on their own, without anybody promoting it, without anything other than that. And that was just, I thought, just keeping it as stripped down and real as possible. And then through random circumstances, just because Rough Trade Records had signed the Strokes in 2000, I guess that was, and the Strokes had met with an immediate success, and everybody was, even from their first 3-song release, and Rough Trade Records of London had also then signed the Moldy Peaches, who were also from New York City like the Strokes, and that also met with a lot of interest and success, and Rough Trade being able to release this sort of stuff in England created a bit of buzz about New York City at that time, and this would have been then like early 2001. And as far as I'm aware of what happened next was that Rough Trade had asked the people in the Moldy Peaches if they recommended other New York City artists, and I really have to thank Adam and Kimya for telling Rough Trade, oh yeah, there's this guy, Jeffrey Lewis, and you should check out his stuff, and here's some of his tapes. And they put some of my tapes onto a CD, because I didn't even have anything on CD at that point. They just took it upon themselves to do that, because they figured if they sent Jeff Travis at Rough Trade a cassette, he might not have heard it, or maybe, it was completely the doing of Adam and Kimya that sort of made that connection happen. And then the fact that Rough Trade contacted me and asked about putting out my stuff was just very remarkable. I mean, that really probably doesn't happen that often. I was just very, very lucky to kind of be in the right place at the right time. A lot of things happened in my favor that could very easily not have happened, and I would have just gone on making my cassettes, and maybe I wouldn't be sitting here in Halifax, England, being interviewed if a lot of those things hadn't happened in just that way. So in a certain way, I was just riding the coattails of the Moldy Peaches, who were riding the coattails of the Strokes, who were, putting Rough Trade back on the map of discovering New York City artists. And I just somehow snuck in, the door opened a little bit, and I somehow found myself falling through it. But doing things in this DIY way, to bring it back to your actual question about being a do-it-yourself artist, it just never occurred to me that there would be any other way to do it. I certainly had no knowledge of recording studios. I had no knowledge of record labels. I had nothing. I mean, I just heard these Daniel Johnston recordings where it's just somebody in a room making up a song, hitting record on a tape player, playing the song, and that was it. There was no band name, there was no style, there was no fancy anything. There was no amplifiers, there was no gear to speak of. And then once I found myself as part of the kind of somewhat normal music industry, being put out by a proper label like Rough Trade and having press and starting to do tour stuff, it also just seemed like there was no point in spending money on anything, because I'm not the kind of artist that's going to have a huge amount of fans. Like, there was no reason to spend vast amounts, or like, how am I going to make that money back? Like, I'm not going to sell that many records. I'm not going to be just doing what I do is not going to reach a huge number of people. I'm just not that kind of artist. So I just felt like keeping everything very cheap just made the most sense, because where's that money going to come from? It's not going to come from my record sales, because I just can't imagine that there would be that many people interested in what I do. So this has all gotten much bigger than I ever thought it would be, but there's still so much that we end up doing ourselves, because it's like, where's that, we're driving ourselves around, for example, we're selling our own merchandise, printing my comic books, manufacturing stuff, so it's just the most direct thing.
Totally unfazed, till sometimes there's somebody who seems totally amazed. I might not be in magazines as a heartthrob face, but in a few devoted hearts I found a strong fan base.
Kind of just being in a room and pressing record and doing it, like, that's happening a lot more because you have like Instagram and TikTok. Like, how do you feel about the prospect of like the death of the record label? Do you think that like more people are like kind of leaning towards DIY, and like how do you feel about that?
It has brought an immediacy back to things in a certain way, where you can just sort of make a song and release it within an hour, basically. It's just released worldwide upon just, writing it. Here's set up the phone and record it, send it out on, whatever platforms, or upload it to streaming. Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost, I think, back in the before albums took over as the format, really in the 60s, I think singles were put out relatively quickly for a lot of artists back in like the early days of rock and roll. The turnaround times were quicker, so I think it's a little bit more immediate like that nowadays. It's interesting that culture follows technology. It seems to me that technology is constantly evolving, because there's just this constant capitalist competition of like, oh, we have to make a better thing because we want to, be more the novelty of a new, better thing. Oh my God, CDs, yeah, throw out all your records. There's this new compact disc technology. Now there's this, streaming. Now there's Facebook. Now there's Instagram. Now there's TikTok. Now there's whatever. So there's always somebody trying to one up each other. It's just it's a jungle out there of one monkey's trying to outdo the anteater, and the anteater's trying to outdo the hedgehog, or whatever it is. Everybody's just trying to maximize their advantage, so that technology is constantly racing forward in all directions, and then culture just kind of is like, oh, well, now there's a phone, and now there's streaming, and now there's this, so what can my creative brain do to grapple with that and find some representation of emotion or excitement or connectivity in this constantly changing technological landscape? Somebody keeps coming up with, the human creativity is constantly forced to grapple with that. If there had been no electric guitars, there couldn't have been Jimi Hendrix, and if there had been no cassette recorders, there could have been no Daniel Johnston. So each technological thing, zines, like punk rock fanzines, there's like, if you don't have a photocopier, like the photocopiers hadn't come in, then like you can't have this whole explosion of zines. Prior to that, there were mimeograph machines in the 60s, and that was like, poetry. It was like, so each time there's a technological thing, the creative culture kind of follows, like, what are these possibilities? So this current idea that maybe there's going to be no more record labels, well, you know, the record labels came into existence following a certain cultural, technological moment, and then the record labels changed as the technology and the culture changed. And I think, just like everybody pressing their advantage, there's always going to be some facilitators and some, you know, middlemen. If there's money to be made, somebody will come in and figure out how to make that money, whether that is the way we think of a record label traditionally in recent decades or some new form. Because I think there's a lot of bands and a lot of artists who don't do what I do with my band, who maybe aren't capable of driving themselves. Maybe they aren't capable of making their own comic books, or they aren't capable of just having the wherewithal to say, well, do I need 300 records on this tour, or 400 or 500? Well, on the last tour I sold 150 records, but the shipping costs are low. You know, there's a lot that I have to do just to make all this happen, and not everybody is going to want to do that or be capable of doing that. So that's when somebody might jump into that gap and say, hey, I'll make the records, I'll figure out what you need for the next tour, I'll ship it for you, and I'm going to take, you know, 40% of the money, or whatever it is. There's always going to be somebody who's going to do some of the work and take some of the money, if there's money to be made. I don't think that, I think of it as like sharks with, there's got to be blood in the water for them to start circling. It's like, people think that they're just going to have a manager and a booking agent and a record label just come in and give them a career. I think people have to have, there's got to be money there before all these people start coming in, or at least the potential for money before people start coming in and wanting to like get pieces of that. So it will continue to shift in ways that I can't predict, but the only thing that never shifts, it seems to me, is just this technology of a blank piece of paper. I'm like, that is the scariest, no matter how much money I have, or how fancy my phone is, or what kind of devices I have, the technology of turning this blank piece of paper, something in my head has to end up on this piece of paper in some form that has a power to it. And that's what it all comes back to, regardless of what happens to it after that. Can I write a song? Can I make up some lyrics? Can I make a comic book? Can I do a drawing? I don't think AI or these generative things are really gonna, there's something about that interface between your brain and that blank piece of paper that is just, I could be wrong. Maybe there will be something that will make that a different relationship between the agony of the blank piece of paper and your brain and that interaction. But to me, that's like what it is. That's like really what it is. What happens after that is just something else.